are in Leviticus 25 and 26, and we're not going to try and do it all. We're going to look at parts of it, but we're actually going to do some parts that kind of go back to Genesis as well, because I heard it said that when you know Genesis 1 through 10, when you understand it, you can understand the whole Bible. Like, the whole Bible makes more sense. And so, with that in mind, I tend to want to go back to Genesis to help explain where things started and how things look, and then how things over here in Leviticus, in Matthew, in Revelation, how they all kind of come back to Genesis. So we're going to start, and if you have your Bibles with you, then I do encourage you to look up the verses and follow along with me. But we're going to be in Genesis 1, and we're going to move. So we're going to move around a little bit, and that's kind of my thing. I like to do that. So if you want, the next verse that we'll look at is in Psalm 72. So if you want to kind of look for that and get that ready, then we'll move back and forth and then go back to Leviticus as well. All right, so you all know these verses. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was unformed and void. Darkness was on the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God hovered over the face of the water, surface of the water. Then God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. So right away we see in the creation story, we start with nothing like I talked about last week, but then God brings in light. Well, obviously the sun and moon haven't been created yet. They're on the fourth day. So what is this light? So turn to Psalm 72, and we're going to look at verse 17. Now, your version may read differently. Not only do I have the Complete Jewish Study Bible, but I also was given, there was a guy on who has his own channel, who does a lot of videos and writes a lot of books, and he is a Messianic Jew. And he actually gave this verse in Hebrew, and I'm not going to say it in Hebrew by any means, but he gave the translation from the direct Hebrew. So in my Bible, it says, "May his name endure forever, his name as long as the sun." Now the interesting thing here, in this one, it says his name, Yinin, as long as the sun. And if I look down at my notes, it says the Jewish tradition considers Yinin a name of the Messiah. So I don't know anything about that, and I'm not going to pretend I know. But here's what the Hebrew says. "May his name endure forever. His name was there before the sun." So who is the light? Not that we know he wasn't created, but it was like God presented his son, their creation. He was there before the sun. So by the end of the creation story, again, like we talked about last week, we have a Shabbat. We have the seventh day, and we see that God is resting. And so if you turn to Genesis 2, there's an interesting thing that's missing here. Does anybody want to guess what's missing on day 7 that's not missing on day 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6? I'll give you a little hint. At the end of day 1, it says, "So there was evening and there was morning one day." At the end of day 2, "So there was evening and there was morning a second day." Same thing with 3, same thing with 4, same thing with 5 and 6. "So there was evening and there was morning a sixth day." That is not said on day 7. I find that interesting. And one of the theories that I found was that it's because the Sabbath, it's God's light. It's God, it's who he is. It's eternal light. So there was no ending it, in a sense. The day continued because it was Shabbat. know if that makes sense, but we'll keep moving on and we'll look through this. So from there, we move into the Garden of Eden, right? We have man and woman were made, or man was created, and he puts them in the garden in Eden. So here is his land. This is his land. This is God's garden, right? So man comes into God's garden to dwell there, to be a priest there, to dwell and subdue the earth, subdue the animals, all of that. So we have his land, but it's our home. So now man becomes evil through Adam, and man continues to get worse. So again, we're just doing a quick overview. So what do we see? When man becomes so evil, God does a decreation. So the very thing he did on day one, or before that even, he separated the waters. He separated the water from the ground and from the water from the sky. He brings back in Noah, he opens up everything in the groundwater and he lets the rain pour down. So everything becomes water again. It's a decreation type of thing. So God takes his land back by decreating it. He also destroys everything except for those on the ark. So everything now that he has made is gone, except for everything that's saved. So again, it's this whole thing about land is you'll hear this common theme. So now further into Genesis, we have Abraham. And what is Abraham? He's called from his own land, from his parents' land, and he's called to a new land. And he's made a promise to be, basically, he and Sarah will be the new Adam and Eve. They will bring a new race of people, so to speak, a new ethnic people into the world and into a land that was promised. But what happens? Further down, several generations, they all moved to Egypt. Now they're not in a land anymore. They're in a land that is not theirs, that has not been promised for them, and they're slaves. So, but now God sends, in Exodus, he sends a savior named Moses. Moses comes in, he frees the slaves. He takes them out of that land to take them to a new land again, to take them to their ancestral land that was promised to Abraham. But before we get there, we stop at Mount Sinai. So what happens at Mount Sinai? So just as an overview, we have the giving of the law, the Torah, but it's like a marriage ceremony. So we have these tablets that come down with Moses, and it's like, if you know anything about a betrothal, there's a contract written up, and that contract is about what the husband will do for the wife, and what the wife will do for the husband, and they agree. It's kind of like a prenup, but it's there, it's written, it's agreed upon, it's signed by witnesses, and it's all there, everything that's going to happen. And at this point that this is all signed and certain cups are drank together, then they are now married. Okay, so this is exactly what's happening on Mount Sinai. There's a marriage going on. God is saying, now I'm your king, you're my people, we're in covenant, we're together, and I'm taking you into now your place to live. So here's the thing, is that this betrothal, if one of them were to die, they inherit everything that the other person had. Okay, so if a woman is left a widow before, at this point of the betrothal, she gets everything that her husband has. She inherits his thing. Okay, so God is giving his people an inheritance just like that. Except we know nothing will ever happen to God. He's never going to go away. Covenant's never going to be broken on his side. Okay? So that's my brief overview. Now we're going to unpack some of that. So if we turn to Leviticus, And we're going to go to Leviticus 25. And actually, before we go there, I skipped one thing, but let me just show you something I thought was interesting. If we look at Leviticus 26, and if you start in verses 3 through 12, and I'm going to kind of read a little bit of what I already went, I didn't read it, but Genesis 1, 28 and 29. We see language that is very much the same. So in Leviticus 26, and actually starting with 25, he is talking about not only the land taking a Sabbath, but on the 7th year, and we're going to get to that, but also that there's a Sabbath after 49 years on the 50th year. So we call that Jubilee. But he goes in and explains that, and again, we'll go back to that. But at the same time, he starts giving them basically curses, promises and curses for what they do and what they don't do. So here in Genesis 1:28, God blessed them. God said to them, "Be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, and subdue it." So in Leviticus 26:9, he says, "I will turn to you, make you productive, increase your numbers, and uphold my covenant with you." And so we see this pattern with everything that's in verses 28 and 29 being again in reverse order spelled out here from 3 to 9 in Leviticus 26. And so he's pretty much repeating himself. And he says here that in 8, 5 of you will chase 100, and 100 of you will chase 10,000. Your enemies will fall before your sword. And then again in 28, he's talking about subduing the world, subduing the earth. And so those go together because they're both subduing. One is subduing their enemies, another is subduing the ground and the earth. And then you have there, I will give shalom to the land in Leviticus 26:6. And you will lie down to sleep unafraid of anyone. I will rid the land of wild animals. The sword will not go through your land. And again, that goes back to you will rule over the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, and every living creature that crawls on the earth. So in one hand, God is going to subdue them all, but in the other, man was supposed to subdue them all. And that continues on. And he even talks about if you walk in the, and I'm just going to skip a little bit, but in verse 3, if you walk by my regulations. And then he says in 12, but I will walk among you and be your God. Well, what happened in the garden? God walked with them. He met them there. He walked with them. So there's this idea of relationship. And what we see here in Leviticus, God is trying to bring that Garden of Eden relationship back. And so he's making promises and he's telling them what will happen if they don't do it, but he's making promises that he'll still walk with them just like he wanted to back in Eden. So let's look at Leviticus 23 and 25. So in Leviticus 23 was last week's Parsha, or Torah portion, and in 15 we are to count the weeks. So, I want to write it and I also want to talk about it. So, first we'll write, so this first thing in Leviticus 23 is talking, of course, about the Feast of Weeks, or Sabbath. So we have the Feast of Weeks, And the same wording is there. It says count, right? It tells us, it instructs us to count 7 full weeks until the day after the 7th week. So we have count 7 full weeks, and that is 7 times 7, but it is weeks, or even counting the omer is, of course, counting the days of those weeks. And then, again, if we kind of skip up to Leviticus 25, a few pages, then we see the same kind of language, and this is Leviticus 25:8. You are to count 7 Shabbats of years, or 7 Sabbaths of years, 7 times 7 years, that is 49 years. So we have over here, we're going to add 1 to equal 50 days. And then over here in Leviticus 25, so this is Leviticus 23, we have Jubilee. Okay, so we also have, again, the same wording, count 7, and I think it says 7 years, right? So we have 7 times 7 again, plus 1 year. So that's where we are. So one is days or weeks, and the other is the years. But you see, it's the same thing, because we're still left here with 50, because we do the plus 1, so it's the 50th year. So we see a similarity there. And remember, this is all about Shabbat. So it talks in here, we have, not only do we have the 50 years here, but we have the 50 days for this, but we also have included in this, the land needs to rest. So here we get back to that land theme, because, and what does that look like? It's every 7th year. So we have a land Shabbat, which is 6 years. You basically, and that's every 7 years. So for 6 years, you plant everything that you want. You till the garden, you do the work, you trim the bushes, you trim the plants, you plant seed, everything for 6 years. And God promises on that 6th year, He will give enough for 3 years. So that not only is it enough for the 6th year, it's enough for the year that you do nothing on the land. And the rule was nothing can be done on the land. There's no tilling, there's no digging, there's no planting. The land must have a rest. So what we see is that He promises, though, that anything that grows wild, I used to always hear it called volunteers. They were volunteers, or they reseed themselves, or of course something like an apple tree, it grows every year if it's healthy, right? So anything that just continues to grow is ownerless. It's not yours. It's not the person who owns the property. It belongs to the whole community, including all the animals. He makes a point of saying, even the wild animals. So anything has access to all of your fruits, all of your vegetables, all your grapes that grow on the vine, anything that's growing up and reseeds itself or comes in voluntarily is for all people. You cannot go out and harvest it. You don't gather it up. You leave it, and people can come.
Is this something that is set in stone for the Jewish community, or is like someone moves into a new home and then they start the 7-year period, then everyone's individual and different?
No, it's all set. So he even warns, he goes, if you buy a house or you buy something, like as far as Jubilee goes, if you buy a house 4 years before the end of Jubilee, you're only in that house for 4 years, or you buy property. So it resets, and it's a set time every year. And in some cases, I mean, we talk, Ryan and I and all of us, we sometimes talk about the different calendars that are used, and not to confuse anybody, but when Jesus, he declared that he was fulfilling Isaiah 61, and it was a year of the Lord's favor, and that is also a Jubilee year. So we'll get in, we'll kind of go there too. But we see this, we see that we have ownerless fruits and vegetables. They go to anyone, the land rests. So what happened in Daniel? For 490 years, they did not obey this law. They forego it, they just forgot, they didn't do it, they purposely didn't do it, they just forgot about it. Because what happened? Canaan had a god that was basically, if I remember correctly, it was kind of like a produce, like what do I want to say, vegetation, but it was the god that blessed the soil, that made things grow. So they were so impressed with how well things grew in Canaan, and then they heard about this god, and they started maybe making an idol here, and they refused to do this. So they were kind of giving in to the god of the land, of course, false god, but they were making an idol out of the land. So what do we see in 26? In Leviticus 26, the first thing he says, do not make yourselves any idols. So he goes through and he's telling them all about this thing right here, this Sabbath for the land. And then the next thing he tells them, and by the way, don't make any idols, because you're going to be tempted to, so don't do it. But like I said, in Daniel, 490 years they went without a single land Shabbat. So God took, and God promises here, I'm in the wrong chapter, but in 26, and I'll find it here, 25, he basically promises them that I will make the land rest whether you let it rest or not. If you refuse to uphold my law of resting the land every 7th year, then I'll remove you from the land so it can rest. And that's exactly what we see in the book of Daniel. He let Babylon come in, take them all out into captivity, and what happens is the land rests for 70 years because they were held in captivity. And that's what we see like in Daniel 10, and where Daniel sees that they're getting close to the end of the 70 years. And then we see in Nehemiah, where Nehemiah now goes at that 70-year mark and around there, and he has to go back. So they start making the walls of Jerusalem. So there's that, a type of Jubilee where they're bringing everybody back to the land, okay? But that's not a true Jubilee in Nehemiah. Okay, but does that make sense so far? Tracking with me here. So we've got the Shabbat, the land for the Shabbat. We have this. So let's talk about Shavuot a little bit. So the interesting thing here, I'm going to move back over here, is that this is where the 50th day, the law was given, the 10 Commandments were given. But what did they just come out of? not Egypt, but what was the feast before this?
First fruits.
Hmm?
First fruits.
Yeah, well, and that, and then again, of course, Passover was the first one, and then you get into the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and of course, Passover is just the meal the night before, and the feasts are actually the unleavened bread and the first fruits. But Passover and unleavened bread was all about eating unleavened bread. But on the 50th day, they brought to the Lord leavened bread. So these 50 days represent going from slaves to sin and maturing into leavened bread. Okay, so it represents a time of maturing. And if you think about these 50 days for them, these were hard days. These were hard weeks coming for the original children of Israel coming out for the very first one. But it represents in our own life that maturing process of going from our sinful life of unleavened to leaven being the bread, okay? So then, we have the Year of Jubilee was the other thing that in this chapter, he talks about. So, what happens on Mount Sinai? Because this is also a type, not only is it one of the feasts that they were to count, but it also compares to this. I mean, we already see how the numbers compare, but let's look at some of the actual comparisons as well. So we're going to go back to Exodus 19. And I'm going to start I'll just start at the 1. So in the 3rd month, after the people of Israel had left the land of Egypt, the same day they came to the Sinai desert. After setting out from Egypt and arriving at the Sinai desert, they set up camp in the desert, and there in front of the mountains, Israel set up camp. Now, an interesting thing here about setting up camp, it was kind of an idiom for being united. Because up until this point, I mean, they were still, we see them grumbling, we see everything. But setting up camp together is a form of being united. They were together in one place, waiting on the Lord, okay? So Moses went up to God, and Adonai, or the Lord, called to him from the mountain. Here is what you are to say to the household of Jacob, to tell the people of Israel. You have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, if you will pay careful attention to what I say, keep my covenant, then you will be my own treasure from among the nations, or the peoples. For all the earth is mine. Okay? So again, underline that, put a little star, for all the earth is mine. Because we see this whole thing with land being a theme throughout all these scriptures. And then it goes on in verse 6. And you will be a kingdom of priests for me, a nation set apart. Where did we see that before? We see it in 1 Peter 2. These are the words you are to speak to the people of Israel. So he summons all the people, and I'm gonna just go through this and summarize. And he basically warns them that he's going to come to them in a thick cloud, and the people will be able. So what we see in this verse on Mount Sinai, on the 50th day, we see the word Yovel, shofar. So here, what is this? What's so special? This was a Jubilee shofar. So we have a type of Jubilee happening here. Because when this, now here's another theme we're going to see. when this certain Jubilee shofar was blown, what could they do? They could come up the mountain. So now that led them to the mountain. To the place, of course, where God resided. But this is interesting because it wasn't officially a Jubilee, but it was because of this. But this is how we see this connection between these two things. So not only do we have similar numbers, but in days and years, but now we have this word in common for this day as well as this year. Making sense? So here's another cool thing. If you, again, we're going to turn to Joshua 6:5. So you know the story about Jericho. So here's what's interesting, and we're going to read again. I'm not going to try and read every word, but we see that Jericho had been, starting in 6:1, Jericho had been completely barricaded, its gates against the people of Israel. No one left and no one entered. So they had put these walls around Jericho. And in a sense, they're saying, this is our land, this is our kingdom, and you're not welcome, and you can't come in. But where was Jericho? It was in the land of Canaan. So here, already, the people had passed through the Jordan, had gone into the land of Canaan. Now they were getting rid of their enemies. But their enemies were marking their kingdoms and their territories, okay, in their promised land, okay? So here we see in verse 2, Adonai said to Joshua, I have handed Jericho over to you, including its kings and its warriors. You are to encircle the city with all your soldiers and march around it once. Do this for 6 days. Okay, so I'm running out of space, but keep that in mind. So on the 7th day, well, it says do this for 6 days. So 7 priests are to carry 7 shofars. So again, now we have 7 priests and 7 shofars. So it says, on the 7th day, you are to march around the city 7 times, and the priest will blow the shofars. Then they are to blow a long blast on the shofar. On hearing the sound of the shofar, all the people are to shout as loudly as they can, and the wall of the city will fall down flat. Then the people are to go up into the city. Well, guess what the word for shofar here is? It is also this. So now we have this going to Jericho. Well, totally spelled it wrong. Because I can't spell it. I spelled it right in my notes, but there we go. Okay, same Jubilee shofar being blown in the land of Jericho by 7 priests and 7 shofars. And then what did they add? They added shouts. Okay? So they were actually to be quiet on all those 6 days, and it wasn't until the 7th day that they were to shout. So the shouts, and I'm sorry, I know there's no rhyme or reason here, but it was on the 7th day. So again, this whole theme. Okay, so now, let's go back and look a little bit about, we're going to go back to the Parsha 25. So in 8, 25, verse 8, you are to count 7 Shabbats a year, 7 times 7 years, that is 49 years. Then on the 10th day of the 7th month, on Yom Kippur, you are to sound a blast on the shofar. So here we have that shofar, and we have the 7th month of the year that it's being blown. That is the Jubilee. Okay? 7th month, and on Yom Kippur, or the Day of Atonement. And in verse 10, and you are to consecrate the 50th year, proclaiming freedom throughout the land to all its inhabitants. It will be a jubilee for you. Now, here's some words if you write in your Bible at all or circle. You will return everyone to the land he owns, and everyone is to return to his family. So we see that twice. Return the land, return the people to their families. That 50th year will be a jubilee for you. In that year you are not to sow, harvest what grows by itself, or gather the grapes of untended vines, because it is a jubilee. So again, now here we see the same thing is happening in this jubilee in this 50th year, just like the land, the Shabbat land, okay? So the same rules apply, except now he added others where, and I think that also applies for the Shabbat, but the people return to their families. If you have a slave, it returns to its family. And if you have property, it goes back and returns to the ancestral family who owned it. Make sense? Okay, so it takes a little while, but we're getting to a point here. So, again, we see all this happening. So, how is this a jubilee? Because who were the slaves? The slaves were Israel. They were taken out of their country, and now they were set free. So we see the same thing happening here as was supposed to happen here. What about the land? They were taken out of the land they were slaves to, and they were now taken to a new land of that was promised Abraham. So you have land that was promised to their ancestor, their patriarch, and now they are being returned to their land that they had rights to by God. Okay? So we see that happening here. We see slaves and we see people who don't have a land being returned and being set free. And that's exactly what the instructions were for the Jubilee year. And then this one fits in as well because the land had rest, just like every 7 years the land had rest. On the 50th year, it had rest. So we have these same things happening over and over. Now, look at Jericho again. What was happening there? They're taking back their land. Because Jericho had decided this was their kingdom and their land, so they built the walls, and now this was theirs. This was all theirs. Well, what did they do? They took their 7 priests with their 7 shofar, and their shouts on the 7th day, the walls fell, they invaded, they took back their land. It was their land, okay? So there's that whole theme. So, if you're keeping up with me, it's basically everything is returned. You are returning people to where they belong. Go back to Genesis. What happened? We were chased out of Eden, so to speak, because of sin, right? So let's move this into the New Testament. We're gonna look up a few verses here. Luke. Well, let's start in Ephesians 2:2. It says that we used to walk in the ways of disobedience and obeyed, and this one says the ruler of the powers of the air, who is at work among the disobedient. So we're describing Satan here. He is the prince and power of this world. And he has a right to be, right? Because of the sin in the garden, he was given something by our sin. He was given some power and authority. But let's go back to Luke 4:5. There's something interesting, I don't know if, that I always found interesting when I read this passage. But this is the time that Jesus is being tested in the wilderness. And first he tests him, of course. Satan comes to Yeshua and tests him to eat, making bread from stone. But then he says in verse 5, the adversary took him up and showed him in an instant all the kingdoms of the world, and said to him, I will give you all this power and glory. It has been handed over to me, and I can give it to whomever I please. So what are we seeing here? Now you may see this a different way, but we already know he's the prince and power of this world, and through sin, and even through our sin today, he still has power. Because every time we sin, every time we, through our strongholds, through our addictions, or whatever they may be, we give him land. It's the word, and I'm going to say it wrong, but it's T-O-P-O-S. And it's meaning give him land. We give him property in our own bodies, in our hearts, for him to do what he wants. It's like inviting him in, okay? So now he's got some deeds here to property, not only in us, but on this earth. Because he's got some authority here that he was given, and he states it clearly that he's allowed to give it to whomever he wants. So he's offering Jesus, you bow down to me, I'll give you my kingdoms. Okay? So here, he's setting up kingdoms on this earth, and what does Adonai say? He goes, the whole earth is mine. But he's got kingdoms. He's got walls. He is building to keep you and I in, just like Jericho. It said they kept the walls up to keep people from coming in and going out. And that's exactly what Satan does to us. His kingdom can be in our heart. It can be in people, in kingdoms of the world. We certainly see in communist countries, these are kingdoms that, we could say are set up in Satan's name. We could go on and think about all the kingdoms he has. And he's the prince of the power and power of this world. So there's some authority there that he has over this world. But what happens, and we see that Jesus now in Isaiah 61, and again, you know it, I'll just read it. And Jesus stands up in Luke, in the Gospel of Luke. He stands up and he says, the Spirit of Adonai is upon me, because Adonai has anointed me. When you are anointed, it's the word for Messiah, okay? So Adonai has anointed me to announce good news to the poor. He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom to the captives. There's that slave thing again. And to let out into light those bound in darkness. So again, we have slavery again. To proclaim the year of favor of Adonai. So here we have, he is announcing that he's the Jubilee, in a sense. It's the year of Jubilee. I mean, not just maybe physically, but also spiritually. He is the one who releases the slaves. He is the one who takes back the kingdoms of Satan from us, who takes them and overruns them and knocks them down like Jericho. And look at what he's going to do. Turn to 1 Thessalonians. and we're in 4:16. Again, look at the words. So, 16, but the Lord himself, of course the Messiah, will come down from heaven with a rousing cry, shouts, and a call from one of the ruling angels, and with God's shofar. And those who died will be united with the Messiah, will be the first to rise, to come up. And then those who are left still alive will be caught up with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. So whether or not you believe that's a rapture, whether or not, whatever your beliefs are, we see the same thing, the same words, the same connotation. We've been slaves. We've had kingdoms in this world that were made and controlled by Satan. And now what is he going to do? He came in his first coming to set us free. And now he's coming to knock down all the walls and take his people who have been slaves in this world to a place where they will no longer be slaves. But he doesn't stop there. Let's go to Revelation. So first we'll be in Revelation 5. So here we see in the very beginning, it says 5:1, starting in 1. Next I saw in the right hand of the one sitting on the throne a scroll with writing on both sides and sealed with 7 seals. And I saw a mighty angel proclaiming in a loud voice, "Who is worthy to open the scrolls and break its seals?" No one in heaven, on earth, or under the earth was able to open the scroll and look inside. But of course, we know. John says, "I cried and cried because no one was found worthy to open the scroll or look inside of it." One of the elders said to me, "Don't cry. Look, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the Root of David, has won the right to open the scroll and its 7 seals." What do we have here in the scroll? Now, you can call it a deed, you can call it a betrothal, it's called a ketubah, or it's a type, it's what they wrote, the contract, like the prenup on. And there are some scholars and some, especially Jewish, who call it messianic, of course, but they call it more of the bridal contract, the betrothal contract. Others I have read where they see it as a land deed. It doesn't matter. It's still who's taking back the land, because even in a betrothal you have a land, an inheritance spelled out in there. So here is the Messiah, and because of his death and because of his resurrection as well, he now can open the scroll, and now he has the land deed. He is now in control of the land and what happens on it. So again, we see this progression of God taking back land until we get to Revelation, where it climaxes. He's taking back not only his people, but he's taking back his land. Okay? And this is interesting. Keep going to Revelation 8. So now in verse 6, there were 7 angels with 7 shofars. Again, very parallel language again. Okay, just different person. And then if you turn to Revelation 11, verse 13, we see that the 7, I'm going to say 15. in Revelation 11:15, the seventh angel sounded his shofar, and there were loud voices in heaven. Shouts. The last one blows his shofar, and we see shouts. And what do we see? We see earthquakes. We see God wreaking havoc on the kingdom of the world, which is now Satan's kingdom. He's taken over. So now what is he doing? He's breaking that kingdom down. These angels with their shofar, just like the priests and the seven shofars in Jericho, now God is using his angels and the seven shofars to break the kingdom of this world to pieces and the walls to pieces. So now Revelation 21, this is where we'll end. And now what do we see? Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the old heaven and the old earth had passed away, and the sea was no longer there. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared like a bride. So we see that language of the betrothal again. Prepared like a bride, beautifully dressed for her husband. I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "See, God's Shekinah glory with mankind, and he will live with them. They will be his people, and he himself, God with them, Emmanuel, will be their God." So now he has freed everyone. He has broken down all the kingdoms of the world, and now he's making a new heaven and a new earth for his people. And we go full circle from Eden to his land, his garden, his priests, his people who were supposed to live there with him. And now what do we see? And also we see that it says that they will be the light. They will be the lamp, and there will be no more sun, no more moon, no more lights in the sky, because God and the Lamb will be its light. So now we see Genesis 1 happening again. There will be light. There will be no sun, no moon, anything else that is in the sky, because they will be our light. They will be our lamp. So we see it all coming full circle from one story after another, and counting the sevens and counting the years and putting Shabbat. And what is, let me show you in Hebrews 10, sums it up pretty well. I'm sorry, I said 10, I meant 4. Sorry, they're nothing alike, but 10's in my mind. So in here, he's talking about, let's go to, verse 3, verse 3. For it is we who have trusted to enter the rest. It is just as he said, and in my anger I swore they will not enter my rest. So this is going back to the Mount Sinai. It's going back to the people, the Israelites in that time. And then he swore this, even though his works have been in existence since the founding of the universe. For there is a place where it is said concerning the seventh day, and God rested on the seventh day from all his works. And once more, our present text tells us, and they will not enter my rest. So he combines now the idea of Shabbat, or the seventh day in creation, with now the rest here of coming in from Mount Sinai into the promised land. And then he also goes on to say, today if you hear God's voice, don't harden your hearts. In verse 8, if Joshua had given them rest, God would not have spoken later of another day. So now, what's another day? It's what we see in Revelation 21, the new heaven and new earth. That's the ultimate Shabbat. Just like I said in the beginning, the light on the first Shabbat was eternal. The light on the last Shabbat is eternal. It's God's light that's shining for us forever. And this is the main Shabbat. All these other Shabbats, all these feasts, all the Shabbat days, all the Shabbat years, they're all going to this ultimate Shabbat for eternity in God's light and in God's earth and God's land with God's people. All back to the way He originally wanted everything. But we have to go through all of this. This is all for our learning. It's all for our own, to understand His ways and His days and His times. It's to help us understand Him better and to be where He is and do what He's doing. So that by the time we get to the final Shabbat, we've had some experience in this. We understand. We know what's going on. And we understand the significance of this final Shabbat. Because we understand where we started back in Genesis and how we got there throughout time. Any questions? Any thoughts on that? So that's where I'm ending. Yes?